13 is not set in stone. It can be done really at any age. I think that my dad and my grandfather chose 13 because, they saw this like, well, there probably is some wisdom in the Jewish bar mitzvah.
Mm-hmm.
And they also, admittedly, 13 years old is pretty young to tell a boy or a girl, you are now a man, you are now a woman. But the thinking is that it's probably better to initiate a boy into manhood a little bit too early rather than a little bit too late, right?
Agreed.
If you wait till they're 18 or 21 years old, by that time, they've probably made some significant life decisions without the full support of their family behind them, So having this rite of passage weekend, it's probably better to err on the side of a little bit too early. Now, that being said, if you have a son or a daughter who's 15 years old, who's 16 years old, it's not too late. Absolutely. 13 years old is not written in stone.
Hello and welcome to the Disrupt the Everyday podcast. We're here to help you navigate life while disrupting the status quo. Our discussions cover a number of topics relevant to everyday life. We discuss everything from relationships to entrepreneurship. We also engage in some difficult but important conversations. And now, here are your hosts, Brian and Tanya Hamilton.
Welcome to another episode of the Disrupt the Everyday podcast. Today we're going to be talking about the entry into manhood, and we're joined by Stephen Arms. Stephen, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Our pleasure. Now, let's start off by learning about you. Who is Stephen Arms?
Well, thanks for asking. So I am a husband and a father. My wife and I were married in 2018, and we have two beautiful children. Our daughter is 3 years old, and we have a 1-year-old son. And then we actually have number 3 on the way here, due in April of next year.
Oh, exciting.
Congratulations.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Besides being a husband and father, I grew up in California. I spent the first 25 years of my life there, born and raised in the San Francisco Bay Area. And I was raised by two incredible parents. My mom and dad are still married today. They just celebrated their 35th wedding anniversary and have been just an amazing role model of what a good marriage should look like for me and for my wife. So I consider myself incredibly blessed to have parents like my mom and dad.
Awesome. So your kids are really young. So you haven't, what we'll be talking about today, you haven't had a chance to do with them yet, but obviously yourself and some of your family members have been through that rite of passage that you speak of.
Exactly. Yeah. So my dad, when he was raising my brothers and I come from a family of 4 boys. So
Okay.
I'm number 2 out of 4 boys. I don't have any sisters. And when my older brother was 12 years old, about to turn 13, my dad wanted to do something really special for him to mark his entrance into his teenage years and mark his entrance into manhood. Our family is a Christian family, but my dad saw the benefit of this whole concept of a Jewish bar mitzvah and kind of how they have this rite of passage into manhood, into womanhood, into adulthood. And it provides this clear entrance into this next phase in life. So my dad and my grandfather kind of came up with this rite of passage weekend for my brothers and for myself.
All right. So I guess you were the second one. You were the second son. So you would have been the second one in your family to go through this. So did you know that this was kind of a thing, or did your brother keep that secret from you? When you had this weekend, was it something you were prepared for?
So the weekend was a total surprise to me. My older brother did have one 2 years before me, but my dad told him to keep it a secret from his younger brothers. And then when I had mine, I was also charged with keeping it a secret from my younger siblings. And actually, all of my cousins in the family got these rite of passage weekends as well. So we were, I think in total, we did 13 of these rite of passage weekends in our family. And we were able to keep it a secret from the next person down the line the entire time. And really, the idea there is that we didn't they didn't want the child to have any preconceived notions of what the weekend might look like. They didn't want us to feel like, oh, everybody in the family gets this. They wanted the boy or the girl to feel like this weekend is really all about them. This is something really special that the family did for them. Kind of like a surprise birthday party, surprise birthday parties, they catch you off guard at first and you might feel a little bit uncomfortable, but you look back on them and you're like, wow, that was a really special thing that person did for me.
Mm-hmm. So I have a couple questions here, but I'm going to stick with, for you, what did it look like when it was your turn?
Sure. So my rite of passage, I'll start by saying that it wasn't just my dad who attended my rite of passage. It was actually my dad, my grandfather, and two of my uncles.
Okay.
And, around the age of 13, fathers and sons, there's kind of this tension that can build up between fathers and sons because the boy is growing up. He wants more independence. He wants to kind of spread his wings a bit. And so naturally, he pushes the boundaries and doesn't always listen to dad. But by getting other men involved in this weekend, it helps to break through to the boy in a way that he might actually listen. So it might be a piece of advice that dad has been giving the boy for the last 3 months, but just hearing it come out of the mouth of a man who's not dad helps the advice to really sink in and makes this whole rite of passage event that much more concrete in the boy's mind. So the weekend, like I said, it was my dad, my grandfather, and two of my uncles. And they took me away to a cabin in Lake Shasta, which is about 3 hours north of the San Francisco Bay Area. And we had this rite of passage weekend. It was a one-night trip. And they had 7 different kind of rituals that made up the weekend. My dad and my grandfather, they knew that if we didn't have a plan for the weekend and you put the 5 of us in a cabin, that we would just spend the whole time fishing, right? I think that's one thing about us as men is that we're not always good at being good communicators and being in touch with our emotions and talking about the really important things in life. And so that's why this whole idea of having these rituals, having these sharing exercises, it provides context and it provides meaning to the weekend. So the first of these rituals is an entrance ceremony. So just like other examples of a rite of passage, like a wedding ceremony or a high school graduation, right? A wedding ceremony is the end of your single life and the beginning of your married life. High school graduation is the end of your high school, the beginning of college, the beginning of your working career. And just like in other examples of rites of passage, those have an entrance ceremony, right? There's this entrance procession. It marks a clear beginning to when this rite of passage is starting. And so in our family, we would read a passage from scripture. It was Moses encountering God in the form of the burning bush. There's a few reasons why that passage was appropriate, but one of the reasons was that God in that passage takes the form of fire in the burning bush. And once we entered the cabin as a group, I, the boy, was charged with lighting a fire in the wood stove in the cabin. And that fire represents God's presence with us during the weekend. It represents the Holy Spirit. And it was my responsibility as the boy to keep that fire going throughout the entire weekend. That was kind of the challenge that was given to me, is never to let that go. And that shows that in our lives, that sometimes our faith life is hotter, sometimes it's colder, but what's most important is to never let that flame of faith be fully extinguished. So that's kind of a summary of the entrance ceremony, and that's the official beginning of the Rite of Passage weekend.
All right. Now, in terms of the Rite of Passage weekend, I think what are some of the benefits that you see in having that? I know, when I think of it, when we think of our Western culture, there's not really a definitive time when you actually become a man. Legally it's when you're, I guess, 18, and there's other milestones like when you can get your driver's license. But what's the real strong significance of having that rite of passage weekend?
I think a rite of passage is important because it gives the boy a clear understanding of when he became a man. And if a boy doesn't experience a rite of passage like this, then he will feel the need to prove his manhood to himself. And what that might look like is the sexual conquest of women. You hear guys saying things like, she made a man out of me, or it could be video game addictions. In a lot of video game addictions, you can create a character that will go out and slay a dragon or kill a terrorist. That totally plays into the male ego of proving yourself as a warrior, proving yourself as a man, or violence. When boys get in fights with other boys, subconsciously they're thinking, if I can prove my physical superiority over another man, then that must mean that I am a bigger man than this person. It's a way for them to prove their manhood to themselves. But what we argue is that if a father takes the initiative and tells his son, I want you to know that in my eyes, I no longer see you as a boy, but I see you as a man, then the boy doesn't feel the need to prove his manhood to himself. Granted, every teenager is going to do dumb things and make mistakes in life. That's just a part of being human. But having a rite of passage weekend, having a clear memory in his mind of this is when I became a man, having confidence in his masculine identity, it makes it so that he doesn't feel the need to push those things to quite the same extreme.
Okay. So I'm just thinking, for families, if the father isn't in the home, that kind of situation, you had 4 adults there with you. What do you say about that? Who are people that you would recommend could step in for something like this?
That's a great question. So, and that situation actually occurred in my family because my younger cousin is adopted from a single mother. My aunt never got married and adopted my cousin. So he grew up really without a father figure in the house. And she saw the benefit of her son having a rite of passage weekend. So she asked my grandfather to kind of lead up and organize his rite of passage weekend. As you can imagine, my grandfather was totally excited about it and said, absolutely, I would be honored to. So if you're a single mother out there listening and you want to have a rite of passage weekend for your son, I would say that you will need to identify a man that you trust and ask him to hold a rite of passage weekend. And one thing about it is that even though you will be asking a man to lead a rite of passage weekend for your son, all of the weight of the responsibility is not going to fall on his shoulders because he'll bring in 3 or 4 other guys as well. So it's going to be a team that does this together. It's not just going to be one person.
Okay. And then also I'm thinking too that, sometimes going back to like surprise parties and all that kind of stuff, it's like this big to do and all this money's being spent, right? Just from what I'm getting from your experiences or your experience and then your family is that really it's the time and the experience, right? It doesn't need to be this big thing. So yeah, I would love to hear your insight. And also, did everybody do the same thing at the cabin or was it different places as well?
You're totally right. It is all about the quality time. I remember being a 13-year-old and thinking, wow, I can't believe these guys, all of these men were married, had kids, had jobs. I remember thinking, I can't believe that they're taking the time out of their busy lives to just focus on me. The weekend, it wasn't fancy. I don't think that my dad put in more than $500 into it. The cabin was actually in the family. So, he didn't even have to rent the cabin. The whole thing, like you said, it's not about the pomp. It's about the time spent together.
Yeah.
And No, not all of us had our rite of passage weekend at this cabin. Depending on where people lived, like I have family down in Southern California, so we had a few rites of passages down there in Southern California. So every weekend was actually kind of a different location um, for each different boy or girl.
Now you mentioned the aspect of a team, three or four other guys coming and participating. What's the role of the other men that are there?
So the role of every man, they're mentors that the boy can look up to. Like I said, the men on my rite of passage weekend, they were examples of good, godly men. They had wives, they had children, they had jobs. So they were men that I could look up to. And as we went through these kind of different rituals that made up the weekend, different sharing exercises, each man was kind of responsible for leading each one, meaning that the man would be the first to share. So another example of one of these rituals was what we called the ribbon ceremony. And in the ribbon ceremony, all the men go outside and they get a stick off of the ground. And the men, they tie 6 ribbons onto their sticks. And then on each ribbon, they write down a positive or a negative character trait that they see in themselves. So their ribbons might say hardworking, loyal, and honest. And then they might say lustful, greedy, and selfish. Those are just 6 examples I'm making up. And then every man shares with the group why he wrote down what he wrote down. He shares why he sees these character traits in himself. And one man will kind of be the leader of that exercise. The boy also has a stick, but his stick is completely empty. And after every man has shared, the boy goes to each man and he unties the ribbons, the character traits that he wants to take off of these men's sticks and ties them onto his own. And this shows that as men, as humans, we have the ability to emulate certain character traits that we see in other people. For example, my father-in-law is really good at giving words of encouragement and words of affirmation. That's just kind of the environment that my wife grew up in. She was always built up. And that's something I really admire about him. And it doesn't necessarily come easy to me, but I have tried to emulate that character trait from him. It's something I admire about him, and I try to copy it from him. So at the end of the exercise, all of the men are left with these sticks full of their negative character traits. And that shows the boy that no man is perfect and that we all have to improve upon ourselves. And as silly as it sounds, as a 13-year-old boy, I remember my grandfather sharing his negative character traits and thinking, are you serious? Like, I just don't see these things in you.
Mm-hmm.
I think as a 13-year-old, sometimes we see life with rose-colored glasses, especially for me. Like, I knew my dad had negative character traits. I lived with him, but my grandfather, I thought he was pretty much perfect, So hearing him say, no, I'm not perfect. This is where I need to improve myself. That was an eye-opening experience for me. So the men, they take their negative character traits and they place them in the fire, which represents 1, their desire, their commitment to burn away their character defects, but 2, their reliance upon God to do so, right? That fire represents God during the weekend. So by placing their negative character traits in the fire, they're saying, I'm not going to be able to do this by myself. The only way I can do this is through God's grace.
That's awesome. Now, the other thing that we wanted to ask about too is, you mentioned that you have a daughter.
Yeah.
And I'm sure there's women in your family. Is this something that's been characterized for the women in your family as well?
Yes. So all of my female cousins got a rite of passage weekend as well. And the girl version of a rite of passage weekend looks pretty much exactly the same as the boy version. Obviously it's the women of the family that take her away to share about what it means to be a woman, what it means to be a virtuous woman. But besides that, the weekend is essentially the same. I don't think that they do a full on fire. They actually bring a candle and light a candle. And then for the ribbon ceremony, they don't use sticks from the outside. They actually all bring tiaras and they tie their ribbons onto tiaras. So there's some small changes like that, but overall, the weekend is essentially the same for girls. You know, my dad and I, we wrote this book together so that you can kind of get the father's perspective and the son's perspective. But because I don't have any sisters, my dad didn't organize any rites of passage for girls. We felt like, you know, we're just not the right people to write that book. So we chose to focus on the male version. But there is a short chapter at the end that explains how you could change this or adopt this for a daughter in your life as well.
Mm-hmm. And I think, you know, it being just a beneficial time either way, right? Female, male, and just also, I'm gonna guess you would agree with me. It can look different for every family doing this. It's really about that time, one, that you're putting aside, and two, what you're teaching this young man, this young lady, right? As they now go into adulthood. I think that's like the most important part.
Yes, exactly. I think every rite of passage has to be tailor fitted for each individual family and each individual child. No two rites of passages should look the same. And we do explore in the book ideas for other families to adopt, you know, some things that we didn't necessarily do in our rite of passage, but these are ideas that you might want to implement in your own family's rite of passage. One idea that was shared with us was every man bringing maybe that a copy of that one book that really changed his life, you know, the most important book that he ever read, and explaining with the boy why he picked that book, what it means to him, what he learned from it, and then even giving him a copy of the book so that the boy is left with, you know, 4 or 5 books that he can read as he grows older and get shaped in the same way that these other men were shaped by these impactful books. So that was something that we didn't do during our rite of passage, but another family could do it in theirs if they so chose.
Mm-hmm. So just going back to your brother, your older one, did he know that this was coming up at 13? Or was this at that age, this is what we're going to do?
It was a complete surprise for my older brother. You know, I would say for that first rite of passage, my dad didn't exactly know what he was doing. So my dad, he actually grew up without a father figure in the house because his parents divorced when he was 5 years old. And his dad, my fraternal grandfather, passed away when my dad was 17 years old. And between the ages of 5 when his parents split up and 17 when his dad died, my dad only saw his father 3 times. Okay. So he really didn't have a relationship with his dad, and he grew up without a father figure in the house. And that's why when he met my mom and got married, he really wanted to be the type of father that he didn't have, right? He wanted to be the type of father who played an active role in his kids' lives, who showed an interest in them, who spent a lot of quality time with them. And that's why he wanted to do something really special for my brother as he turned 13 and became a teenager. And he didn't exactly know what to do. And so he kind of brought this idea to my maternal grandfather, his father-in-law. And he said, you know, I want to do something special for my son, but I'm not sure what to do. And it was my grandfather who said, well, you know, in other cultures, they have this whole idea of a rite of passage. Why don't we try it and do something like that for your boys, you know, and I'll come along too, so that it's not just you and your son, but let's get the whole family involved. So that's kind of how this whole rite of passage tradition got started.
That's awesome. So I'm just thinking for people who are listening and their kids are past 13 now, they're like, oh man, that sounds like a great idea. I wish I would have done that. I'm going to guess that it doesn't matter. You can still try to plan something and, you know, create that time for your child. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, the short answer, I would agree, is that 13 is not set in stone. It can be done really at any age. I think that my dad and my grandfather chose 13 because, they saw this like, well, there probably is some wisdom in the Jewish bar mitzvah.
Mhm.
And they also, admittedly, 13 years old is pretty young to tell a boy or a girl, you are now a man, you are now a woman. But the thinking is that it's probably better to initiate a boy into manhood a little
Mhm.
bit too early rather than a little bit too late, right? If you
Agreed.
wait till they're 18 or 21 years old, by that time, they've probably made some significant life decisions without the full support of their family behind them, so having this rite of passage weekend, it's probably better to err on the side of a little bit too early. Now, that being said, if you have a son or a daughter who's 15 years old, who's 16 years old, it's not too late. Absolutely. 13 years old is not written in stone.
Mhm.
No, but it's interesting that you mentioned that, and obviously the wisdom in the Jewish tradition. But with a lot of the other Christian guests that we've had on the show, I think specifically of John and Renee Harris, they highlighted 13 as that kind of significant age for young men and women as well.
Mhm.
Yeah. I mean, even naturally, 13 years old, it's already a big deal in the child's mind because they're becoming a teenager, right?
Right.
So it,
Right.
it already means something to them. This weekend just takes it to the next level and says, not only are you becoming a teenager, but you're also becoming a man.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
So I'm just thinking here, the last ritual that you would have done that weekend, what did that look like?
So the last ritual is the formal bestowing of the title of man. And just like you see in a high school graduation, one of the last rituals is the conferring of diplomas. That's when you go up on stage, you shake the president's hand, you get your diploma, and you've officially graduated high school at that point. In the rite of passage weekend, the last ritual is the official bestowing of the title of man. And that's when the men gather around in a circle, and either the dad, in my case, it was actually my grandfather because he was kind of the patriarch of the family. He, had some words written out that essentially said, Stephen, in this family, you are no longer considered to be a boy, but you are now officially a man, just like one of us. And it's your responsibility to be the type of man that we have called you to be. And, I, at the time, I didn't realize what an important moment that was in my life. But as I've gotten older, I've come to realize what an incredible blessing that was to have a memory, to have a clear marker in my mind of this was the moment that I became a man. I didn't have to question my manhood as I went through my teenage years. I didn't feel like I became a man when I married my wife at 27 years old, or when I bought my first house, or when we had our daughter. For me, it came much earlier at 13 years old. And I think that to me has been an incredible blessing.
And so the process of putting all of this into words as well. So you said you and your dad worked on the book together?
Yeah, my dad and I co-authored the book together. So in the book, you kind of get his perspective as the father. You get my perspective as the son going through this weekend. And then the whole second part of the book is really a how-to guide for families to organize one of these rites of passages for their own children. Another really cool resource that we have is we've organized 5 different email templates, and we've posted them for free on our website on milestonetomanhood.com. So if you're interested in organizing a rite of passage weekend like this, you can go to our website, go to the planning section, and just copy and paste these emails to send out to your team, to send out to the other men who you want to attend this rite of passage weekend. And these emails explain what a rite of passage is, why you want to hold one for your son, and then what exactly you'll be doing through the weekend. We realized half of the battle is just getting the other men involved and explaining what this weekend is and why you want to do it. And we've been organizing these weekends in our family for the last 20 years. So why not just give the words to your audience for free? We don't ask for your email address. I know that a lot of people don't want to be spammed. So we figure let's just post them on the website and people can copy and paste them from there.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, sounds good. Now, the other question I wanted to bring up was because you guys have been doing this for years, the timing of the book. Why now?
So there's a few reasons why now. I would say that. So my youngest cousin had his rite of passage in 2020, and that was kind of the last of the generation. We always wanted to keep this rite of passage a secret from each boy or girl who went through it. So we never really talked about it like in front of the children of the family. And it was always kind of kept hush hush, but we felt like, now that this whole generation has gone through it, this is kind of the perfect time to share it with the rest of the world. My daughter is the next in line. She's only 3 years old now. So we kind of have a 10-year gap before we're going to restart this whole family tradition and have more rites of passage. So we thought, this is kind of the perfect time to write the book.
Mm-hmm.
Very cool. All right. Just kind of to wrap up the conversation here. When you think back on your rite of passage weekend, is there one kind of moment that stood out for you among everything that was going on that weekend, or was it just the whole experience in general?
I mean, the whole experience in general was really special to me. I don't think that there was one experience in particular that was like a highlight. But I will say one really cool part of the weekend is the giving of letters to the boy. So every man in the group, but also the women of the family that aren't on the weekend. So my mom, my grandmother, my aunts, and also my Boy Scout troop master at the time, my football coach at the time, they all wrote me letters about, how much they loved me, what I meant to them, giving me advice or encouragement as I entered into my teenage years, as I started my journey on manhood. And my dad presented these letters to me, and, I didn't read them that weekend, but I read them afterwards. And I still have those letters today in a binder in my desk. And, I read them about once a year. And as I've gotten older, those letters mean more and more to me. Especially, two of my grandparents have passed away since my rite of passage weekend. So obviously I can't have a conversation with them today, but I can read those letters, and that gives me a lot of comfort. It's really, to me, a keepsake and a treasure that I was given. So that was another really cool part of the weekend, was this gifting of letters to the boy.
Oh, absolutely. And it's just confirmation, right? It really does take a village. Like, it's not just the parents. There's so many people that, we can use to really help invest in raising our children and nurturing our children. That part's really great too.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's all about family, I think.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Well, Stephen, thank you for taking the time to share all of this information with us. And I'm just going to post the information, just the name of your book again, Milestone to Manhood. And for all of the links for any other information, we'll have them in the notes as well below. But milestonetomanhood.com is the website. Stephen, anything else that we need to know about before we wrap up today?
I don't think so. Brian and Tanya, thank you so much for having me. It's been an honor to be on your show.
Thanks so much for sharing and taking the time.
Yeah,
absolutely.
For everyone who watched or listened, thank you for letting us disrupt your everyday.
Thanks for listening to the Disrupt the Everyday podcast. For more ways to listen, connect with us on social media. To be a guest or to partner with us, check out our link tree at Disrupt the Everyday. Join us next time for more ways to disrupt the everyday.